Learning Objective 5 introduced us to a couple of other tools that we could use, CVP or cost volume profit analysis, to analyze in our organization. So remember, those were calculating break even for more than one product. If we have multiple products, how do we determine when they have different sales and variable cost, what our contribution margin is, and utilize that contribution margin to calculate break even? We talked about the margin of safety and operating leverage. So let's take a look at an example of some of these using Crazy Custard Donuts. So if we'll take a look at the information that we have for this organization, it gives us their contribution margin income statement now. So it's really a good review of how the contribution margin income statement varies from our financial statement that we're using externally. We have sales less variable cost to come down to contribution margin. We subtract fixed cost to come down to operating income. Okay, so sales and operating income don't change regardless of which method we're using, but how we calculate them does, and how we utilize the information in between is different for external people in financial situations than it is for internal people when we're making managerial decisions. So the problem has asked us to calculate, first of all, a weighted average contribution margin. Use that weighted average contribution margin to calculate a monthly break-even point in dozens of donuts. Then to calculate margin of safety, a degree of operating leverage, how we can use that degree of operating leverage to predict what a sales increase would do to the organization, and then finally the contribution margin income statement that includes that increase in sales for us. So we need some information in order to do this, and our book tells us that our sales mix is 4-to-1. How do we know that? Well, we sell 4 dozen plain donuts, four dozen plain donuts for every 1 dozen of custard-filled donuts. So we need to know our sales mix when we're calculating break-even for multiple products. Here our sales mix is 4-to-1. For every 4 dozen plain donuts, we sell 1 dozen custard. The plain donuts sell for $4 a dozen, variable cost of $1.60. The custard sells for $8 with a variable cost of $3.20. So let's calculate our weighted average contribution margin to get started. Okay, contribution margin, simply sales less variable cost. So when we calculate sales less variable cost, we can generate contribution margin per unit for each of those dozens of donuts. However, they're different. So how do I know which contribution margin that I need to divide into fixed cost to come up with my break-even in units? And I can't simply say $2.40 plus $4.80 divided by 2, because we don't have the same sales mix. Okay, I sell 4 dozen plain donuts for every 1 dozen of custard filled. So I have to take that into the consideration, and I have to multiply my sales mix times this new contribution margin that I've come up with to calculate, to begin my calculation for weighted average contribution margin. So the next step that I have is a contribution margin of $9.60 and $4.80 or $14.40 for my donuts. But this is $14.40, okay, for how many units? 5 units. How did I come up with 5? 4 dozen plain donuts for every 1 dozen of custard filled. So I'm dealing with cost for basically 5. We could carry this extension out. 4 plus 1 is 5. So $14.40 divided by 5, using my sales mix ratio, tells me that my weighted average contribution margin per unit per dozen, okay, is $2.88. So in order now to calculate break even, I simply take my fixed cost with a target profit of 0, since we're doing break even. I divide by my contribution margin per unit to come up with 15,000 units to break even. Okay, but be careful, okay? 15,000 plain filled and 15,000 custard filled? No, I need to sell 15,000 units, and remember, these units are in dozens, not individual donuts, but dozens of donuts. So that 15,000 needs to be allocated back out among my sales mix, which our text told us was 4-to-1. 4 dozen plain for every 1 dozen custard filled. So 15,000 divided by 4 or 4/5. Divided by 4/5 tells me that I need 12,000 dozen plain donuts, and 1/5 of those need to be custard, so 3,000 dozens of custard-filled donuts. So once again, your first step when we have multiple products is to determine your contribution margin per unit, weight it times your sales mix to come up with a weighted average contribution margin per unit, calculate your total break-even, and then allocate that break-even back out to your sales mix, which was 4/5 and 1/5 in our particular situation. Okay? So if we were to put that together as your book asks us to do, can we put this into contribution margin statement showing that our profit using the 12,000 and 3,000 estimated donuts would generate enough income to revenue to cover our cost? We can see that happen. We simply plug in $4 a dozen. At 12, our sales revenue is $4 a dozen for the 12,000 plain, $8 a dozen for the 3,000 custard filled, for $72,000 in sales. Our variable costs were $160 for the plain, $320 for the custard filled. Once again, back to our prediction of the number we need to sell, and I can see that my sales will cover, my contribution margin is $43,200, and that will exactly cover my fixed cost, giving me operating income of $0. So we can calculate break-even in units, and we can calculate break-even in dollars as well. And so in this case, they've simply broken it down for us to say if we have, we could take this one step further if we wanted to and turn this into sales dollars as we have here, or the units that we have. Either there are multiple ways that we can calculate break-even. Using the equation, using contribution margin ratio, or simply coming up with a number of units and extending that out to my sales and contribution margin. Now, if we'll skim back up, requirement 3 asks us to take a look at this margin of safety. Remember, that's our cushion. How far can my sales fall from my expected sales before I am losing money or not generating a profit? Okay, and the illustration that was provided for us told us that our expected sales were 125,000. We have calculated break-even sales of 72,000, so my margin of safety is simply 53,000. This sounds complicated. It is not. How far can my expected, that's the key, how far can my expected sales fall before I am not generating a profit anymore? It's my cushion. So if we scoot back up, it asks us finally to calculate the degree of operating leverage and how a 40% increase in sales would impact us using the leverage formula. Our degree of operating leverage is simply contribution margin divided by operating income. Well, we've calculated our contribution margin above. Okay, it was actually given to us. Sales less variable costs generate a contribution margin of $75,000. So I'm going to divide operating income, also provided above, into contribution margin to show that my degree of operating leverage is 2.13585. And so we can calculate what a percentage change in sales revenue, this is where we started, if our sales increase by 40%. And my operating leverage is 2.35. How would that impact my operating income? Okay, so once again, it's really just a prediction. And what we can figure out based on the calculations that we have so far, 2.3585 times 40% shows us that our operating income would increase by 94% if sales increased by 40%. All right, and we can use that to calculate what our operating income would be. If it's 31.8 at this point, and we increase that by 94%, it would generate operating income for us of $61,800. Remember, why is this important? The more fixed cost we have, the more leveraged we are. So the higher, this number will be higher if we have higher fixed cost. And so if I'm leveraged fairly high, that means increases in sales generate more operating income. But it also means that a decrease in sales of 40% would generate a decrease in operating income of 94%. So there is risk to go along with the reward of being highly leveraged. And then finally, it asks us to pull this together into a contribution margin income statement so that you could see this change. If sales increase by 40%, 125 times 40%, then variable costs will also increase by 40%, generating contribution margin of $105,000. Now what's key here is that our fixed costs are not going to change. And this is what is driving our financial or operating leverage. So now I have $105,000 in sales to cover $43,200 in fixed cost. My operating income would be $61,800. So if you will learn to think through these requirements instead of just memorizing the math, we can take our formulas that we have calculated, our 2.35 in operating leverage and our 94% anticipated increase in operating income, to plug those numbers into our contribution margin income statement to see if it actually works. Okay, I know this is a lot of information at one time, but try to think through how this information can be used to make business decisions instead of just memorizing formulas. And I think you will see that it will be easier for you to work through your homework problems when you understand why you are performing these calculations and not just how.